Let's bring in the Deputy Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, Daniel Wild. Dan, we are seeing the Albanese government veering further and further towards leftist idealism with a raft of radical policies with the potential to do enormous harm. They've abandoned reason, it seems, for this ideology. We saw it with The Voice, we're seeing it with the NDIS, their climate policies, the immigration detention debacle, and increasingly in their response to the Israeli-Hamas war. And Janet Albrechtsen has written a fantastic piece in today's Australian, pointing out that Labor is being hijacked by activists. She says, not only is idealism insufficient to secure results, on its own, it will often hurt those it aims to help. Yet the Albanese government is bathing in the stuff, submerging the rest of us in it too. Domestically, idealistic policies untethered from reality and from the lessons of the past are everywhere. Well said there, but how much longer can the government afford to listen to these radical activists, especially with their increasingly divorced from reality climate targets?
Well, Rita, this government is clearly more radical than the Whitlam government. That's been the case now for a number of months. Anthony Albanese ran as a sort of moderate centrist, trying not to reveal his fairly radical past, but he's always been on the far left of the Labor Party. So those of us who have been watching politics for some time knew it was going to be the case that this would be a fairly radical government. You've had the Voice to Parliament, which was one of the most divisive proposals ever put to the Australian people, and thankfully was rejected by 60% of Australians, including 40% of Labor voters. You rightly mention net zero and the climate targets. They've got a renewables-only, renewables everywhere policy, and that's why we're seeing prices go up and the prospect of blackouts. And then there's the whole social agenda and the veering to the far left on the Hamas, Palestine, Israel situation. So look, I think the sheen has well and truly come off the Albanese government as Australians learn more about just how divorced it is from the interests and concerns and values of mainstream Australia.
Now, doesn't this sum up Victoria? The unions are running riot. The CFMEU are threatening to impose a work slowdown on all AFL-related projects unless the AFL sacks its head of umpiring. The Herald Sun reveals that AFL employee Stephen McBurney used to be a building watchdog regulator, and he initiated a bunch of legal action against the CFMEU that's resulted in millions of dollars of penalties against them. And now they're essentially, Daniel, blackmailing the league to sack the head of umpiring or have their projects adversely affected. They're holding the Tasmanian Stadium to ransom, threatening work to rule campaigns, and they're not shy about doing this. The Victorian CFMEU boss, John Sedka, told The Australian, this is going to cost the AFL a lot of effing money. I hope it's worth it. Projects without our full cooperation are going to be effing misery for them. They will regret the day they ever employed him. They just don't walk away from a role like that. This is the employee they're talking about. It costs the union millions of dollars and just think they can walk away into the effing sunset. It doesn't work that way. This is the real world. We go after our enemies, and he was our number one enemy, and we will pursue him until the ends of the earth. These are direct quotes from John Sedka. Welcome to Victoria. You know who's running the show down here, Dan?
Well, that's right. I've got to say, Rita, though, it's hard to have sympathy for the AFL. I mean, they've promoted every single woke left-wing cause under the sun, whether it's same-sex marriage, whether it's the Voice to Parliament, whether it's climate change, whether it's welcome to country. It never ends. And the reality is it's not bought them the political protection they thought it would. So, you know, they're the wokest, most divisive sporting code in the nation. The Tasmanian Stadium, it was a political move, not a move for footy fans. It was a political move to cosy up to the government in order to get money from it. So, look, that's how the AFL operates. And I think this is really a test for the Victorian government, the Victorian state government, who clearly needs to intervene here. and to set a clear demarcation that you can't, you just can't, whatever your feelings are on the AFL, you can't just have a union official bullying and essentially holding these major projects to ransom. But I don't think the AFL have a lot of sympathy in the community because of what they've done to divide Australians over the last 5 years.
You are absolutely right. They have been at the head of all the sporting bodies when it comes to playing political games, these divisive political games, alienating half their fan base. And because the sport is so enormously popular, they've largely got away with it. Now to a story we've been covering for some time. You and I have chatted about this, and the Age newspaper has now published data backing up precisely what we've been talking about. And that's Victorian Labor's war on property investors. The Age revealed the number of rental properties in Victoria has fallen by over 10,000, Dan, in just 3 months. In the past year, nearly 16,000 rentals disappeared from the market. And it shouldn't be a shock when we look at the Labor government's war against mum and dad property investors. They've got increased land tax, they've got bunch of unreasonable minimum standards that are being imposed on them. And no wonder mum and dad investors are putting their hard-earned elsewhere. But Dan, I mean, this is just catastrophic for renters because the number of properties available for rental are diminishing and, of course, rents are going up.
Well, that's right, Rita. Look, you've got two problems here. You've got the accelerator has been pushed on demand with the mass migration program, which has been completely out of control for 2 years now. It's been at record levels. Our analysis showed that 70% of new builds last year were taken up by international students alone across Australia, not just in Victoria. And then at the same time, as you've identified, you've got the brakes being slammed on the supply side. We know housing construction is down at 1980s levels, and you've got all of the red tape, the taxes that exist on constructing new houses in Victoria, but just as importantly on those who want to invest in new property. So it's just basic supply and demand. If you push demand up and you bring supply down, you're going to get shortages and you're going to have price rises. That's exactly what's happened, and it feeds into the broader issue, Rita, which is that Victoria is Australia's economic basket case, and this just reinforces that reality.
Sadly, it's hard to argue against that because our debt is out of control. And if the state government wasn't enough with their war on landlords, you've got a far-left council in the north of Melbourne that, let's not forget, changed its name from Moreland to Marybeck because there was once a Jamaican sugar plantation with slaves called Moreland, so they had to change the name. This council is now considering a plan to double the council rates for landlords. I guess they really do hate renters in Marybeck, Dan, because you're going to make it very difficult and expensive for anyone to rent a property if you press ahead with this crazy policy.
Well, that's right. I mean, obviously, it's just going to make a bad situation worse. That's obvious. I think you wrote about this council a couple of years ago when they were, basically saying Australia Day should be cancelled and they weren't going to celebrate it because it's a day of mourning and so forth. So this is one of the wokest councils that you'll ever come across. And, they're supposed to be in favour of renters. But like you identify, if you put the cost up of constructing dwellings or of having people invest in property, then that's going to flow through. That's what we've seen across the state and across Australia. So look, I think it's just a matter of time before young people finally wake up to the reality that these councils and these left-wing governments are not acting in the interest of young Australians whatsoever.
Now, last week, Nigel Farage had a milkshake thrown on him in an assault some in the British media called a humbling moment. Some disgraceful reporting there. But now a man has been arrested after Farage was pelted with rocks on the campaign trail. Let's have a look. Now, Farage said that the local police in the Yorkshire village of Barnsley had warned him not to walk through the town. But this is supposed to be Britain. Politicians should be able to campaign without the fear of being assaulted, Dan.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's another example of the victim blaming that we've discussed. It's the job of the police to protect people who want to safely walk through the community, especially politicians when you're leading up to an election. It's vital to a democracy. I think good on the police, though. It looks like they apprehended those individuals pretty quickly there. Look, there's a broader thing here, though, Rita, which is Nigel Farage has been one of the single most consequential figures in Western politics over the last decade. I mean, if it wasn't for Nigel Farage, we wouldn't have had Brexit. We've had basically 14 years of Conservative government in name only in the UK. And I think, regardless of how many seats Reform end up winning, if it's 1 or 5 or 10 or 20, I don't know what it will be. But Nigel Farage has changed debate. He's getting more attention, more publicity than the Conservatives. He's offering a different vision, saying, look, you have to reduce migration, you've got to fix the culture, you've got to fix the broken political system. So, look, he is a force like one we haven't seen for many years. And I think we need more political leaders like Nigel Farage that will make a debate, and speak up for people that don't have a voice in politics.
You're absolutely right about the Tories being a Conservative in name only, and I think they've lost so much trust with their voters. They won in a landslide, but they governed like they were Labor light. And I think Farage is going to change that landscape again. And it's interesting, we've got the UK about to veer to the hard left with a Labor landslide at a time where most of Europe is going to the right, as we saw with the recent EU elections. So it's a fascinating time. Now, news of the Victorian government appointing a parliamentary secretary for men's behavioural change. How Orwellian. Well, it's been mocked far and wide, including by one of our fave comics, Ryan Long. Let's have a look.
Australia has officially appointed a Minister of Men's Behaviour Change, and he looks like a pretty cool guy who I would imagine is swimming in tons of However, because this guy is such a Chad, it appears the Australian government has forgot to appoint a Minister of Women's Behaviour Change. And so, I will be officially appointing myself, Ryan Long, to that position. I will be coming to Australia with my aggressive proposal to assist Australian ladies in improving their behaviour, which will include no more saying you weren't hungry and then eating off your boyfriend's plate. If you wanted that meal, you should have got that meal. This isn't a buffet. No saying they aren't like other girls, then being exactly like other girls. No more posting every moment of your life on social media. You get one post to showcase what you're doing a month, and the rest of the time you're just gonna have to live your life. And no more asking dudes to take the photos either. No more fist fighting with your wife, and that one obviously only pertains to lesbians. Stories about work will now be limited to 1 minute with the stated premise to be delivered within the first 30 seconds. No more shoplifting. Talking behind each other's backs, then pretending to be friends in public will be barred. OnlyFans chicks will only be allowed to scam the same man out of money once. He already got his money, keep it moving. No more turning this sucker into a whale. No more poisoning your husband. Women will only be allowed 1 day a month to have their periods. So whatever changes you gotta make to have that happen before I get there, I recommend you start now.
He's besmirched all of Australia with that policy. It is only just Victoria. But in the interest of equality, will we eventually get a parliamentary secretary for women's behaviour change, Dan, to battle toxic femininity, perhaps?
I wouldn't be holding my breath, Rita, for that to happen. And look, I mean, there's so many things you can say about this, but what I would say is it's just another example of the divisiveness of the Victorian government. That's been a theme of this government, whether it was in COVID, there was 2 sets of rules. If you were a Black Lives Matter protester, you could go out there and protest. If you were someone that didn't want lockdowns, you were arrested. Whether it's to do with the voice and the treaty process of dividing Victorians, the way they treated small business owners and workers as compared to big business and public servants. This is just another example in a long line of very divisive policies and a very divisive attitude, of the Victorian government. And I just think most people these days have just had a gutful of these sort of gestures where they, don't really understand why someone's getting so much money to take on what is clearly a divisive, tokenistic role. So, look, I think most people will hopefully see through this.
Dan Weil, thank you so much for your time this evening.